The federal deficit does not matter. Video number 1, revised. P.O.F.O.S.I.E. My name is Oscar Dean Wyndham. What in the world is P.O.F.O.S.I.E.? P.O.F.O.S.I.E. is an acronym spelled with all capital letters with a period after each letter, which represents the formula in parentheses, which has produced the answer to the nation's government spending shortfalls in my fictional and non-fictional novel titled Revised Second Edition, all about equity spending with a love story, and at the same time illustrates the answer to our real world government spending shortfalls. In other words, no more deficits and pretend national debts. That is to say, there will be no more deficit spending and calling it a debt. It sounds more complicated than it really is, mainly because the entire concept being verbalized sounds so foreign at this pivotal point in history. But trust me, it's all very simple once you understand the basics of it all, which boils down to the absolute fact that our federal deficit doesn't matter and we don't really have a national debt. I know you may be thinking I'm crazy, but I'm not. I can prove everything being presented here, and I'm asking for you to hear me out. There are tremendous benefits just waiting in the wings for all of us if we just pause for a moment or two and consider the facts, which will inevitably lead us to having a single-payer/universal health care program that will require no out-of-pocket expense from anyone, but definitely it will not be free and will definitely require, for the sake of keeping inflation in check, that there will be no gangsta health insurance companies involved. By the way, P.O.F.O.S.I.E. can be used as a greeting as well as a farewell, just like aloha or shalom, as you can see indicated in the upper left-hand corner and the lower right-hand corner of my whiteboard, which contains the entire outline for the audio presentation of this video. After you read my book, the revised second edition, it all fits. It all makes perfect sense, and I hope you do take the time to read my book, especially if you are interested in really knowing what's going on behind the scenes up on Capitol Hill. I've been trying for the better part of 10 years now to get the word out about the federal deficit being irrelevant, and really picked up the pace back in 2012 when I wrote the first edition of my book, short titled Equity Spending, coming out in June of 2012. The inspiration, the sheer audacity for writing such a book came from having heard former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney both go on the public record and state, and I quote, "The deficit does not matter," end quote, back in 2008. If you will think back some years leading up to and including 2012, you will recall that these were some very tumultuous times for our nation and indeed for the entire world. Coming off the 2008 financial shakedown, we had our first black president. There was quantitative easing and monetizing of our fictitious national debt. There was the Mayan long count calendar, which some are saying predicted imminent doom and gloom. There was the Hopi Indians prophecy. There was the obvious fulfillment of Bible prophecy, with the very high likelihood that the Christian church was about to experience the rapture at any moment. In other words, the entire world was exhibiting signs of an imminent and complete nervous breakdown, and here we have me, a complete nobody, novice writer/novelist who is basically traveling on the unauthorized coattails of former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney, and basically telling the nation, don't worry, be happy because the federal deficit does not matter. Exactly. That's what everyone was saying, even though former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney are both Yale graduates, with George W. Bush also having an MBA from Harvard, two of the best and most accredited Ivy League colleges in the world. They were, and still are, being ignored in favor of believing in a fictitious doom and gloom scenario. Of further interest is the fact that there are very strong indicators that former President George H. W. Bush gave both these men tutorage on the premise of the federal deficit being irrelevant. That's three Yale graduates, with George W. also having an MBA from Harvard, but the public so far is not interested, hence my book. The only book in the entire world at this time that explains in detail the how and whys of the deficit being irrelevant. The most unique, the most complete book you will ever read, which deals with the now proven fact that the deficit truly does not matter, which of course means that we do not have a national debt. What we do have is a pretend national debt, which our elected officials in Washington are loath to admit, in large part because of sheer ignorance on the part of some of our members of Congress, and for others who are more enlightened, the well-founded trepidation, worry about how we, the people, will receive the truth about our federal deficit being irrelevant after having been lied to for these many years, and they really should be worried, especially given the fact that former President Obama and now President Trump have said that the deficit is irrelevant. They haven't come right out and stated for the public record yet that the deficit is irrelevant like Bush and Cheney, but their fiscal policies most definitely said and are saying that they both understand that the deficit does not matter. Me personally, I have no problem whatsoever with our federal employees electronically generating the monies needed and in many cases apparently wanted in order to facilitate the function of our nation in a somewhat smooth and orderly fashion. We're talking about trillions upon trillions of electronically generated monies being added to our $23 trillion deficit, or perhaps even more, that our federal employees will admit to. And then we're going to add all the proposed federal expenditures to come in the near future, which could be in excess of $6 trillion due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But our federal employees, which includes President Trump, so far are refusing to tell us the truth about the deficit being totally irrelevant. In order to wrap this up, let's briefly discuss the last topic listed on my whiteboard, which, as you can see, is inflation. This, I believe, is probably the major cause for all the trepidation our members of Congress and President Trump are experiencing, who also understand that the federal deficit is irrelevant and who are also very reluctant to come forward and go on the public record. They rightly so are apprehensive about there being an episode of runaway inflation when the truth about our federal deficit being irrelevant is brought to the forefront. They know or seem to think that the American people are just not prepared. There does not seem to be a consensus at this time for there to be a smooth transition into openly electronically generating monies to meet federal expenditures, which is, by the way, another one of the main reasons why I wrote my book. As far as the threat of runaway inflation, it's like a guy who is starving to death while standing on the corner opposite the corner where there is a hot dog stand where he can buy a hot dog and not starve, but between him and the hot dog stand there is 8 lanes of heavy traffic, 4 lanes going in the opposite direction from the other. These 8 lanes of heavy traffic represent the dangers of inflation. If our political leaders aren't real careful, inflation can run us over. So what's the answer? The starving guy, which represents we the people, needs to take the proper precautions before crossing these 8 lanes of heavy traffic. He or we should go to the light pole that our political leaders have had installed and press the crosswalk button, which will bring traffic to a halt while we safely cross at the designated crosswalk. We the people make it safely to the opposite corner and are able to purchase a hot dog and not starve to death, thanks to our competent political leaders taking the necessary measures to protect us during this brief period of transition from one corner to the other. This is to say that our elected officials will have to do their job, and this impending economic transition, this new paradigm, will go smoothly. If not, we're in for tumultuous times ahead. Before closing, we really do need to address the primitive, outdated definition for inflation, which is a steady rise in the level of prices related to an increased volume of money and credit and resulting in a loss of value of currency, opposed to deflation. This really is an 18th century definition of inflation which disregards the effects of greed and avarice, which are and have been proven to be a major factor for inflation. Then there is the blatant misunderstanding of our currency having a loss of value, which is impossible considering the fact that the value for our currency is derived from, as well as being based upon, our nation's most valuable, most precious asset, which is we the people. Not gold, not silver, not diamonds, and not crude oil or any other commodity, but again, we the people, and we don't devalue. What the definition should include in this regard is that there is a reduction in the buying power of our currency, not a loss of value. Something else that isn't addressed in this antique definition is the part which states an increased volume of money and credit, which if made available to the entire nation is inflationary, but as the 2008 financial shakedown has proven, when you concentrate vast sums of money and credit as well into the hands of a select few, the effects of inflation is negligible, as opposed to electronically generating trillions of dollars and giving it away to the masses, which would of course be disastrous if done during a time of prosperity and or regular economic conditions. On the other hand, during times where there is an emergency and the need for our government to supply a very large sum of money arises, then the ability to electronically generate the monies is there and should be exercised in order to prevent an economic meltdown. What we are talking about is the judicious oversight of our virtually, no pun intended, unlimited financial resources due to the now proven ability to electronically generate monies in order to meet federal expenditures of any amount. And we're talking about the necessity for being ever mindful of the fiduciary responsibility. Whatever the case may be, our current definition of inflation is woefully wanting and is truly an 18th century definition being applied to our ever-evolving 21st century economic system, and it must be revised in the near future. In closing, allow me to state the obvious. It is impossible to cover every aspect having to do with our federal deficit being irrelevant in just one or even two presentations, so you can be sure, Lord willing, that there will be future videos that will delve more deeply into this evolving subject. For instance, at the very heart of the entire matter is the fact that we already have right now an international one world currency system, and everyone knows exactly what it is, but not everyone knows they know. If you've read my book, you do know and acknowledge what this international one world currency is, and this fact, as well as other salient truths associated with our rapidly evolving economic system, will be addressed in detail in upcoming videos. Video number 1 transcript is available on my Facebook page, P.O.O.F.O.S.I.E.